Hello everyone, welcome back to Flying Through the Helicopter Flying Handbook. This video is about Chapter 5. This is the Robinson edition of this chapter. And Chapter 5 is all about the Rotorcraft Flight Manual. So what is that? That's what it sounds like. Every rotorcraft, at least every modern rotorcraft, is going to have a flight manual that tells you how to use it. There are standardized sections in this manual, and rather than just kind of iterate over these sections from the book, this is actually a pretty short chapter, something like 6 pages long. I thought it might be a little bit better to kind of walk you through some actual manuals. So I have another video out there for the Schweitzer that will kind of walk you through that somewhat. Just disclaimer, I am not going to walk through every single bit of this manual. We're just going to kind of show you what the manual looks like, and we will definitely be going into some more details on different sections of these manuals in future videos. So for example, the next chapter in the Helicopter Flying Handbook is all about weight and balance. So we're not going to talk about weight and balance as it applies to any particular helicopter here. We're just going to kind of give you an overview. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We'll have a look at this guy. This is the R44 Pilot's Operating Handbook, which is synonymous with Rotorcraft Flight Manual. And you'll notice that these always have some sort of a page that says, this is an approved document. This is from the FAA that they have approved this for use with this aircraft. Okay, so there's kind of a preamble all the time, some preliminary stuff. And once you get past those preliminaries, so here, we have a log of changes that have been made. And then we get right into the first section. First section is the general section. It describes the helicopter. So if you look, it will describe, what are the systems? What kind of rotor system does it have? In the case of the Robinson, it's going to be a semi-rigid two-bladed system. It's an underslung rotor system. And they're going to give you the dimensions of that helicopter. I'm going to tell you, okay, this is how big the rotor is, how tall the thing is, and all of that. So that's the general section. It's going to give you just the high points. The rotor system is free to teeter and cone. It's rigid in the plane. It's a 33-foot diameter. What's the blade chord? And then they talk about the tail rotor. How does that work? What kind of a drive system do they have? They have a series of V-belts. What's the ratio between these different things in the helicopter? Okay, the power plant, it's got a Lycoming O540 F1B5. So the O stands for opposed. 540 means that it is 540 cubic inches of displacement. And then the rest of it is just specifics about that engine. They tell you some of the details concerning the options on that particular engine. It's a 6-cylinder engine, and it is rated at 260 horsepower at 2,800 RPMs. However, you are not allowed to exceed 205 horsepower on a continuous basis, and you have 225 horsepower available for up to 5 minutes. And that's the kind of stuff you're going to get in the general section. That leads us to section 2. That's all about limitations. What can you not do with this particular helicopter? So they will start with general limitations, things like you can never exceed 130 knots in this thing. And if you're over a certain weight, it's 120 knots. And don't you try to do an auto above 100 knots. They have the rotor limits, or your max and minimum with power on. 102%, which is 408 RPMs. 101%, which is 404 RPMs. That is a pretty tight tolerance. Think back to the Schweitzer. If you saw that video, if you've ever flown a Schweitzer, you realize that the Schweitzer is much, much wider. And with the power off, you still have a pretty narrow band. You go to maximum 108 and a minimum of 90. So we're looking at a difference of only 72 RPMs between the max and the min. By comparison, on the Schweitzer, you're looking at a difference of over 100 RPM, roughly a little bit less than 400 to a little bit over 500. Incidentally, if you exceed the 108 RPMs, you have to essentially throw your rotors away. You have to have them inspected, and you're probably going to throw them away. So, sorry, there just went $50,000 because you oversped. Okay, and they have a little bit more about limitations on the power plane. Some of that was described in the first section. What's the weight limit? Maximum weight is 2,400 pounds. Minimum 1,550. Maximum per seat is 300 pounds. And the maximum in the baggage compartment under the seat is 50 pounds. Other limitations, aerobatics, no way. Not with that rotor system. You know, it's dangerous enough that it has its own special FAR on the additional ways this thing can kill you. So there's absolutely no excuse for trying to do aerobatics in this helicopter. And related to that, low G cyclic pushovers are prohibited. Again, it's a great way to kill yourself in a Robinson. And there's other limitations. You can't fly it with the governor off. You can't operate above 14,000 feet density altitude and not above 9,000 feet AGL, so that you can get on the ground within 5 minutes. If you take the doors off, 100 knots max. Operations, VFR day and night. That's it. You cannot do IFR in a Robinson. They are not approved for that. You can do instrument training, but that's it. So that is section 2, all about limitations. That gets you to section 3. Section 3 is all about emergency procedures. So you're going to have, what happens if you lose power at 3 different altitude ranges? What if you have a fire? Things like that. They start with auto rotations, essentially, and they talk about definitions. They have land immediately. You see some place you can put the helicopter down, do it. And then land as soon as practical. Are you close to an airport, or are you close to a decent landing strip? Maybe it's not an airport, but it's a very wide open area. Maybe it's a little bit farther away than something that says land immediately. Land immediately would be a situation such as we've had a major failure or you're on fire. Okay, so when you have a power failure, what do? Of course, very soon in your training, you learn auto rotation, down right aft, you drop the collective, you pull aft on the cyclic so that the nose doesn't just plummet, and you put in right pedal because power goes in, left pedal, power goes out, right pedal. And if you're above 500 feet, down, establish 70 knots, you are going to drop the collective. Now in the Robinsons, they're a little bit weird because they have the low inertia rotor systems and you have to play with it a lot more. Something like the Schweitzer, you just drop the collective and you just go to sleep till it's time to flare at the end. In the case of the Robinson, you tend to drop it all the way, then you pull it up a little bit and then you push it down again. And you have to nail the speeds because there's no energy stored above your head. It's all kinetic energy and potential energy. So you have to manage the energy by managing your speed. What if you're between 8 feet and 500 feet? It's about the same thing. It's just slightly different because you're not necessarily going to try to aim for a certain speed. You're just going to go with what you got. Below 8 feet, this is sometimes called a hovering auto rotation, which is not terribly correct. It's really an engine failure and a hover. You're pretty much going to just say, all right, pedal, you're going to put in right pedal, let it settle, and then pull the collective to cushion the blow at the end. And they go into some other details. How can I get a minimum descent? And I can alter from the default of 70 knots and 100 RPM, 100% RPMs, things like that. Okay, and then there's other kinds of emergencies. What if I'm landing in water? I've got the power on, let your passengers out, and then come in, shut it off, hit the rotors on the water, stop them, and then get out. That's with the power on. If the power is off, very similar, except for you aren't going to let people off. You're just going to do an auto rotation into the water. What do you do if you lose your tail rudder? Well, you can try to maintain a certain speed, 70 knots, and that might help you not start turning. You can enter an auto rotation if there's no power being delivered to the rotor. There's no torque to oppose with the anti-torque system, and you can just go ahead and hope for the best. And of course, more about that later when we get into emergency procedures. And they'll talk about things like, what if you have a hydraulic failure? What if you have an engine failure while you're starting, while you're in flight? How should you handle that? So if you're going to fly a Robinson, you should definitely familiarize yourself with this. What do you do if the governor fails? It's really hard to fly a Robinson without the governor, especially the 22. The 44 is not as bad, but they're both not great. Okay, and that brings you into section 4. Section 4 is about normal procedures. So it's going to start out with things like, what's a pre-flight? They have their recommended speeds. You take off and climb at 60. Your maximum rate of climb, your VY, is 55. It's a helicopter, so your VX is 0. Your best angle of climb speed, you can go straight up if you have enough power at least. Your maximum range is obtained at 100 knots, and your maximum cruise 110. Now it says certain conditions may require lower speeds. So if you start hitting turbulence with the Robinson with that rotor system, you want to slow down. You don't want to become a statistic. So you're going to have to slow down a lot, 60 to 70 knots. So one of the upsides of the Robinsons is that they're a little bit more speedy than some other helicopters, but not if you hit any kind of turbulence. You better slow down. Come along here at 110 knots. That's pretty respectable, but I'm hitting turbulence and now I'm doing 60. Okay, so they'll walk through a pre-flight check. Now, most people will take this checklist, this official checklist, and they'll customize it a little bit for their particular aircraft, but it's usually going to be based off of what's in the book. How do you start the helicopter? Again, people are going to customize this a little bit. You start the engine up. How do you do your pre-takeoff checks? How do you take off in this helicopter? What's the cruise procedure? If you take the doors off, it decreases your maximum speed. Then how do you do a practice auto rotation? This is something you'll do a lot, and you'll normally do a power recovery where you don't go all the way to the ground. You will put in some power at the end and go into a hover. And why would you do that? Well, you can get 90% of the benefit with 5% of the risk of balling up your helicopter. So why wouldn't you want to do that? What about going all the way down to the ground? This is something that normally is only done for CFI applicants. A lot of Robinson schools will not let people do this at all. In fact, I was at a Robinson school recently with another CFI, and I said, hey, why don't we do some auto rotations to the ground? And I was told, nope, we can't do that. How do you practice having the hydraulics off? How do you use carburetor heat? There's something called carburetor heat assist in some of the R44s. And what does that do? It basically, as you lower the collective, it adds carburetor heat. How do you land? what's the shutdown procedure, and that's the kind of stuff you're going to see in Section 4. Section 5 is all about performance, and you're going to get things such as my in-ground effect hover and my out-of-ground effect hover. So what's my hover ceiling? In-ground effect versus my weight. So I'm here at my maximum weight. If it is 40 Celsius outside, which is pretty hot, I can do barely 3,000 feet for an in-ground effect hover. Now, if it's 30, which is something you might actually see, and I'm at max gross, I'm still only at 4,000, which isn't great. And then what about out-of-ground effect? Out-of-ground effect is going to be even worse. So out-of-ground effect at full gross, and again, 30, it's not even doable. So at 20 Celsius at full gross, my out-of-ground effect hover is something like 500 feet. Then we have our height velocity diagram. This is something else we'll talk about a lot. Basically, we have these shaded regions, and you're trying to avoid flight in the shaded region if you can, because if you had an engine failure and had to do an auto rotation, it's going to be hard to do it successfully without damaging something and possibly hurting somebody. Also in the HV diagram, you'll see the recommended takeoff profile, which pretty much means that you're going to accelerate at a low altitude and then climb out at 60 knots. That's the recommended procedure for the Robinson. All right, Section 6 is all about weight and balance. Not going to touch that one because that's the subject of the next chapter. Section 7 describes the different sections in the helicopter, and in detail they're going to describe things like the rotor systems. So, it's a 4-place helicopter. What's the rotor like? What's the construction of the rotor? They have a somewhat atypical construction. They have this honeycomb structure and this spar and the skin that's bonded to everything. Part of the reason why they have a life limit on these rotors, and also why they're so expensive. Section 8 is all about ground handling. What kind of documents do you have to have? That's what's required to be on board. What about inspections? What can the pilot do? How do you handle it on the ground, including how do you use the ground handling wheels? How do you fuel the helicopter? And then there's Section 9. So Section 9 is all about supplements. So if you have optional equipment installed, or you have a different version of the helicopter, sometimes you'll see things like a police version of the helicopter, then how is that different? What are the additional things you need to know to operate a helicopter that is equipped with non-standard stuff, such as the pop-out floats, for example? And that brings us to Section 10. Section 10 is an optional section on safety tips and notices. And this is another one of those areas where Robinson does a pretty good job, I have to say, with their manuals. I think they're a lot more thorough than some other manufacturers. And this last section is nothing but safety tips. And these are pretty much based on bad things that have happened. So they start with some general stuff, don't push the nose over, get into low G situations, that's bad. And then they will have essentially stories, if you will. And they'll say, hey, there's something that happened in a Robinson that was bad. So they have all of these notices. So here's the very first one, issued in January of 81. Somebody accidentally did something and something bad happened. So they made a notice. And notices 2 through 8 have gone away. So here's notice 9. Many accidents involve dynamic rollover. Wow, who'd have known that? So how do you avoid that? Fatal accidents caused by low RPM rotor stall. All right, how do you avoid that? So they have these, and they just continually add to them as more and more accidents occur. Okay, so again, we didn't cover everything. This was intended as a quick overview of a Rotorcraft Flight Manual using the Robinson R44 as an example. So again, if you're flying one of these, you should definitely grab it and read it cover to cover so that you know your aircraft well. Okay, so that's all for this video. We will see you in Chapter 6.